Hey, this is Dr. Corey Glenn with Blue Sky Bio, and I'm going to be demonstrating in this video our new fully guided Crestal Sinus Lift Kit. Now, if you're familiar with our classic hammerless Crestal Sinus Lift Kit, this is an excellent set of instruments, but it is designed for a freehand approach. You know, you have the Neurosurgical Burs, which don't cut soft tissue, and you have these drill stops that you would incorporate to control your depth. The difference with these is that this is still going to use the same neurosurgery style burrs. And you can see what these look like. These are designed to push a little bit of bone ahead of them without cutting the soft tissue. And so unless you put just a lot of excessive pressure and go way too deep on this, then you should be able to safely breach the sinus floor without damaging that membrane, complete your lift, and then place the implant. So let's go through a simple procedure on this model. We're going to be placing an implant in this site, and it measures about 8 millimeters from the crest of bone up to the sinus floor. And I've removed the sinus membrane on this side so I can kind of show you what these drills are looking like as they're approaching that sinus. So always start by measuring your vertical bone height so that you know when you need to really slow down and try to start discerning when you've breached that sinus floor. So I'm going to grab the very first drill in the kit, which is in the upper left corner. This is a 3.6 by 2.5 in length. And it's also worth noting all of these drills are 3.6 in diameter. Unlike the old kit where they got sequentially bigger, all of these are going to be 3.6 in diameter. The reason for that is because 3.6 is an ideal sized hole to be able to introduce your graft material and elevate the membrane, but it's not such a large hole that you're going to have difficulty getting primary stability. Generally, if you're doing a sinus lift, you're probably going to be placing a 4.0 or larger implant, in which case a 3.6 osteotomy is going to be ideal. We've measured the distance on the cone beam from the crest of the ridge to the sinus floor, and it measures about 8 millimeters. So this is the first drill. It's also worth mentioning that this is the one drill in the kit that is end cutting. Okay, if you can see that, this one does cut on the end when compared to the neurosurgery burrs. Okay, so the purpose of this burr is to create the purchase point in the ridge and to create a funnel for all of your subsequent drills to go into. Now, since it's 2.5 millimeters, you wouldn't want to use this in a sinus where you only have a couple of millimeters of bone, or maybe just a single millimeter, like an eggshell sinus. This would not be the ideal scenario to do a crestal lift. So here we've got plenty of bone. If you've got 3 to 4 millimeters of bone height, then you should be great to use this kit. And we're going to take the initial burr and we're going to go in through our guide, and going up and down, we're going to just peck away at it. With any kind of guided drill, don't ever just get in there and just let it spin for a long time. That's a good way to generate heat and cause some problems for the patient. You end up getting bone dieback. Okay, so the drill has bottomed out on the stopper, which is on the drill, and now we switch over to the safe-ended sinus burrs. So now I'm going to grab the 3 millimeter sinus burr. We'll go in, take it to depth. Now, since you're only going in 1 millimeter increments, this should go very fast. And I do know, since I've got 8 millimeters of height, that I'm not anywhere near the sinus, but I'll show you how do you tell when you've breached the sinus floor. The best way to do that, where you don't have to rely on tactile sensation or visualizing the membrane, is to just take the next length of drill, introduce it into the site without it running. And when you seat that all the way down, if there is still a gap between the stop and the guide, then you know that you've still got bone ahead of you. And in that case, you would just step on the pedal, go another millimeter deep. Okay? We can grab now the next drill, which is a 5 millimeters, place it in. Without it running, you see that there's still a 1 millimeter gap here. So we step on the pedal. All right. Go to your next drill, 6 millimeter length. All right, it's bottoming out without the drill stop touching, so we've still got bone ahead of us. All right. And And now we're up to the 7mm drill. So this would be where if I was doing this on a real patient, I would have probably just blown through those drills without doing a whole lot of checking, because I know I'm not going to get to the sinus membrane. But now as we're getting close, this is where you really slow down and want to evaluate whether or not you are through the membrane. Okay, so here again, it looks like there's bone ahead of me because there is still a gap right here between the drill stop and the guide tube. So I'll step on the pedal, go another millimeter deep. Now we're going to break through at some point within the next drill or two. So I'm just going really carefully to make sure that we're not going to put excessive pressure on the membrane. All right, here again, I've still got bone ahead of me because the drill does not go all the way to seat. So step on the pedal. Now that was the 8mm length. I would suspect that we've probably broken through at this point, although tactily and visually I can't really tell that. So I'm depending on, again, verifying by whether or not this burr seats or not. Okay, now you see the difference here. When I take this drill in, I'm not even running it, and yet it goes all the way to the stopper. That tells me that we've breached the sinus floor, and I've not risked putting any excessive pressure on the membrane. The most pressure that we can put on the membrane is about 1mm of vertical height. That's generally not enough to damage the membrane, and it should keep that intact. So I don't even run that drill. I can just take this one out, and now we can begin the lift. Now just to show you on the opposing side what this looks like, I'll introduce this into the sight. That one is a little bit long, as you see, so let me just grab a different drill so that you can see how this looks without the membrane in place. Okay, so you see that one just gets through the sinus floor without going too far. So that's about where you would break through the sinus floor, and again, just pushing up on that 1mm is not going to do any significant damage to the membrane. So we've gone through the sinus floor. Now we're ready to start introducing graft material. I'm going to grab the Graft Carrier, okay? And this is just a curette style instrument that has a spoon-like end where you can grab some bone and just hold it near the osteotomy site. Now I've seen this kit used a couple of ways. Some people like to go ahead and just introduce the bone right into the guide tube. So I'll do that, a couple of loads of bone just so you can see it. All right, so if we were doing it by this method, you would just take this, and usually I would have an assistant holding this, and I would just use a graft packer to rake that off into the osteotomy site. You don't want to go too much at any one time. If you go too much, then that makes it very difficult to compact. And so I'm filled this up about halfway, and now we'll begin compacting that. Now, if you remember, we broke through at 8mm, and this is the next step where you potentially could go wrong with this. If you now just went and started poking in there really deep with a plugger that doesn't have depth control, you could very easily cause a perforation. With these, again, you've got a built-in stopper on your graft carrier. Okay, so there's no way that I can push this deeper than that 8mm where I know we broke through. That's going to make sure that the graft material is the only thing putting pressure on the membrane. So with a little bit of bone in the osteotomy site, I'm going to just go ahead and start poking at it. And as I do this, I use a lateral kind of wobbling motion. And what that does is that gets that bone to condense laterally and doesn't just put all apical pressure on this, okay? Now for the remaining loads, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the guide so that you can see a little bit easier. All right. Now, I should say that when you're doing a sinus lift on a Crestal approach, you can't really know how much bone volume you're going to need ahead of time. That's because every sinus is shaped a little bit differently. If it's a big, wide sinus, then you might need a lot more bone to get 2mm or 3mm worth of lift than you would if you were doing this in a really skinny sinus. Okay, so the only way you can tell is to periodically stop and take a PA and verify how much of a lift you have at this point. Okay. Now I might have put a little too much bone because you can see I'm struggling just a little bit more to poke that bone in. And this works better when you're using real graft material. I'm having to use synthetic stuff here. You can see a tiny dome is beginning to form right here under the membrane, and that's exactly what we want to do. Another thing you might consider using is like a bone syringe. You can get these from most instrument companies. I really like using a syringe to introduce my bone because it's easier to control and you don't end up with as much wasted falling out in areas where you don't want it to. So another load of bone, 8mm side on the stopper, and I'm just going to do that wobbling motion to condense that. And then it's just back and forth, continuing to place more bone as we go. Now some people also like to, before they start introducing any kind of a graft material, to either put PRF in there. That would be my preferred material to use, or if you don't have access to a bloodline, you could use like a collar plug. Collar plugs work great. I usually cut them into halves or into thirds, and I would poke those little pieces up into the sinus membrane, and I'm just creating a bit of a cushion so that as I introduce the graft material, if there's any sharp edges, it's not going to come in contact with the membrane. Rather, that PRF or the collar plug would do that. So we're getting close now. If this were on a clinical patient, I would take a PA at this point and see how much of a lift I've got. And what you're looking for is a nice rounded dome of bone. If you looked in there and you see on your PA that it looks like there's not a dome being created, or if you see a small dome but it looks like there's it almost looks like smoke coming out of a chimney. If that's happening, then you might have caused a perforation, in which case it's good to abort at that point, close up, come back and try again at another 8 weeks. Okay, so we're getting that nice dome of bone, exactly what we're wanting. And if I was doing this clinically, I would just make the determination if I've got enough height yet. I'm going to do just a couple more loads and then we'll go ahead and place the implant. Wobbling motion to condense this. And you can see now the stopper, obviously it doesn't work in the same way as the drills do, where the stopper is on the drill and that's bottoming out on the guide. Rather with this, the packer portion is designed to go internal to the hole, and then it's going to bottom out on the ledge that's right here on the carrier. That will just hit on the crest. One more load of bone and we'll place the implant. Okay, so we bottomed out now. And with that complete, you would now want to come back and use your regular osteotomy drill and take it to the full depth of that bone. So remember, if we had 8mm of bone height, then I would want to go ahead and grab an 8mm final drill. So if I grab my fully guided keyless kit drills, or if you're just using this, you know, your other implant system, you would just grab the final drill. And again, you're not trying to take it to the full length of the implant you're placing. Rather, you're just trying to go down deep enough that you profile the full height of the osteotomy, and the bone will condense out of the way as you go to place that. So the bone has been placed, the lift has been completed, and now we're ready to place the implant. Now, since I am using this Blue Sky Bio fully guided keyless kit, what I'll do is place this implant on the guided carrier. If you were using another brand of implant, then you could just place it freehand into the osteotomy that you've got created here. But again, the beauty of having this all within the Blue Sky Bio systems is that these kits are fully compatible, so I can just grab the exact same keyless drills out of the regular osteotomy kit and begin placing this implant. It goes through the exact same tube here. So I would rotate this in by hand as much as I could, You could use the thumb knob if you want. And once it's too tight to tighten by hand, now you can switch over to a ratchet. So as I begin tightening this implant in, I'm watching very carefully to see when that stopper on the carrier bottoms out on the guide tube. It's critical when using this kit that once that stopper hits, you gotta quit cranking it. Because if you don't, then what happens is that the implant can't go any deeper, but you're still spinning it in a circle, and that will cost you all your primary stability. You've essentially turned that implant into an auger now instead of continuing to place it deeper. So that would complete the procedure. If I remove the guide now, you can see the implant in place, exactly where it should be. If by chance you needed to adjust your timing, your degree of rotation, again, don't try to do that with the guide in place. You only want to crank far enough that that stopper touches, and then quit cranking with the guided driver. If I needed to adjust the timing, maybe to put a flat to the buckle, at that point I would just grab a normal freehand implant driver and just put the final turn on this. So if I want a flat to the buckle, we can turn this about another 20 degrees, and there we go. And that's the completion of the procedure. So a really easy kit to use. It's about as dummy proof as we can make a sinus lift. The depth control is the critical point in all of this. You've got both depth control with your packers. You're not going to risk putting excessive pressure on the membrane with that. And you've also got the depth control on all of the sinus drills. So great kit, and I hope you found that useful.